Tom started at 5 Eyewitness News in September of 1992 after reporting and news anchoring jobs in Austin, Minnesota, Fort Myers, Florida, and Des Moines, Iowa. He hosts the 5 Eyewitness News At Issue public affairs program on Sunday mornings. In 2002, Tom authored Inside the Ropes with Jesse Ventura, a book about the remarkable 4-year term of Governor Jesse Ventura. And I'm hoping you're writing another book on post years now. So, never mind. Tom has received 3 Emmy Awards for At Issue as the Best Public Affairs Program and 2 Emmys for television hosts of the Minnesota State High School Hockey Tournament on KSTC TV Channel 45. Please join me in a warm TwinWest welcome for Tom Hauser.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just waiting for that audio landmine to go off again. I'm wide awake, though, on the plus side, so that's good. And you know, Michael, if 10 years ago you had stood up here and said we encourage tweeting, you would have had a lot of blank stares. And I know about getting blank stares, so it's amazing how things have changed. I'm going to introduce the panel here in a moment. We want to get going because we're running a little bit behind. We want to get you out here by 9 o'clock. But I want our panelists to know that if you start running long, the way you will know that you are running long, everyone out there will be playing with this Citizens Bank doohickey, trying to figure out what it does.
It's a taser.
So yeah, it does double as it, let's find out. So just look out in the crowd. If you see people starting to do this and pulling it out, you know you've lost them.
They're tasing themselves.
Exactly. Well, anyway, welcome. I'm happy to be back here moderating this panel. We've had many of these same people on the panel over a number of years, and it's always very informative. And I hope you enjoyed spring yesterday. It's over now. Summer is only a week away, so we can only hope that maybe that lasts 2 or 3 days. So we'll see what happens. Well, let me go ahead and introduce our panelists. I will begin with the man immediately to my left. Logistically, not politically. Brian McClung formed MCPR in 2010 after serving nearly 6 years as Governor Tim Pawlenty's press secretary, director of communications, and deputy chief of staff. McClung has more than 15 years of experience working in media, public affairs, and government, including positions at WCCO-TV, KCCO-TV in Alexandria, the TwinWest Chamber of Commerce. You are an alum, that's right. And the Minnesota Senate. In 2008, McClung was honored with the Minneapolis-St. Paul Business Journal's 40 Under 40 Award. Are you still eligible for that? Or I didn't think so.
2 weeks ago.
Which recognizes talented and successful and formerly young leaders in the Twin Cities. And parenthetically, I should mention that Brian likes to move his offices every 6 months or so just because he loves to throw office warming parties. So, and
Press release, too.
I know, I applaud you for that. Next, Todd Rapp, all the way down there at the end, currently serves as president at Himley Rapp and Company in Minneapolis. Prior to joining his current firm, Todd served as director of Minnesota Government Affairs for Xcel Energy, where he developed and managed company strategies for legislative affairs in the areas of energy, environmental, and tax policy. Todd has also worked in a number of key roles in Minnesota government and politics, serving as executive director for former House Speaker and Majority Leader Phil Carruthers, campaign director for former Majority Leader Roger Moe, and as political director for the Minnesota DFL Party. A nice warm round of applause for Todd Rapp. Next, Noah Roan. Next to him is the founder and president of the Roan Group, a Minneapolis public affairs and communications firm. In 2013, he was named as the Emerging Entrepreneur of the Year by the TwinWest Chamber of Commerce. And his work was recently recognized by Politics in Minnesota for Business Campaign of the Year. Noah and his wife Carrie live in Minneapolis with their 2 children, Connor and Preston. Noah is an active member of the community, serving on many nonprofit boards and advisory committees, including Ticks for Tots, TwinWest Chamber Foundation, and the Minnesota Chiefs of Police Foundation Board. Let's have a warm welcome for Noah. And last but not least, a man who I used to have a lot of fun sparring with across the hall in the Star Tribune offices, Dane Smith. Since 2007, Dane has served as president of Growth and Justice, a policy research center that focuses on economics and state and local tax and budget policy, advocating for smart public investments that advance both business growth and economic justice. Founded in 2003, Growth and Justice is celebrating its 10th year as a practical and progressive influence in Minnesota on education, transportation, healthcare, environmental, and government accountability issues. Dane also had a 30-year career in journalism, reporting and writing on politics and government for the Minneapolis Star, the St. Paul Pioneer Press, and the Star Tribune. A warm welcome this morning for Dane Smith. I'm going to run a tight ship here. We got 8:23. We're hoping to wrap up by somewhere between 8:50 and 9 o'clock. So I'll ask you to keep your responses certainly complete, but also make them brief. First of all, the question for all of you, just a show of hands, are any of you considering running for Congress in the 6th District? Anyone?
I would like my name to be mentioned, but I'm
Okay.
not really considering
Okay.
it.
Anybody else just want their name mentioned? Would that be helpful at all in your... Seems like we're always having to ask that question everywhere we go. But seriously, Brian, I will start with you. I want each of you just to give me about 1 minute on what you think the legacy of this 2013 session is going to be. What is it going to be remembered for? It can be anything, economic, social policy, whatever you think.
The legacy of this legislative session was status quo government, no reform, plus $2.5 billion in new taxes and fees. So we had a situation where there was about a $600 million deficit, and they raised taxes and fees by 4 times that amount permanently. And we know that in the out years, the budget was balanced. Minnesota's government is on track, and that was due to the work of Governor Pawlenty and Republican majorities in the legislature before, who had balanced the budget without raising taxes. Minnesota was doing well. We were on the right path. And yet, you had Governor Dayton now unleashed by DFL majorities in both the House and the Senate, who raised taxes by $2.5 billion for this temporary problem that we saw. And so now you have government adding between 1,200 and 1,400 new government employees. And those government employees aren't going away. Once those government employees are at work, you're going to be paying their salaries and their benefits for a long time to come. So we shouldn't be growing jobs in government. We should be growing jobs in the private sector. And I think they hope that Minnesotans have a short-term memory loss about what happened this session, and I don't think that's going to happen.
All right, Brian McClung, thank you very much. And now I think it was Monty Python who often said, and now for something completely different, let's hear from Dane Smith.
Yeah, completely different. And Brian and I have, and the rest of the panelists have known each other and gotten along for years, and we agree on a lot of things. Growth and Justice actually agrees with major pieces, fundamental pieces of this TwinWest policy agenda over the years. I specifically would point out your investment in transportation, light rail build-out, early childhood education, the foundational investments that we do through our public sector and for our communities that really are an underlying basis for economic growth. Our state economist has been telling us for years that Minnesota's prosperity has depended on these foundational investments. That's physical infrastructure and human capital. And this session was unquestionably an advance in investment in human capital and infrastructure. Actually, one of the most disappointing things is the failure to pass a major transportation and bonding bill, which is relied upon by many, many businesses for jobs and economic growth. But the early childhood investment, I think, may be the single most important achievement. For years, business leaders in this state have understood that the disparities in educational outcomes were driven by these early childhood disparities. We know that high-quality early childhood education is a remarkable lifter of human productivity, readiness, and success all the way through school. Some of the lead proponents of this legislation have been business types, Federal Reserve Vice President Art Rolnick and others. So that achievement, I think, may be one of the most long-lasting and impactful positive effects that our legislature has ever produced. Certainly there are disappointments. I think in general, I would agree with the group Small Business Minnesota, some of the legislators here who spoke about the investment that we achieved. In a back and forth, I want to respond to the scale of the spending and the taxing increase, put that in perspective. But in general, I would agree with the kind of surprising 34% in this poll who believed that there was moderate to very good benefit from this session.
All right, thank you, Dane. And Noah?
I think my microphone was the cause of the problem, so I'll just speak up as opposed to waking you all up with another loud, or I can lean into Dane here. No, I would call this the good news session, unless, of course, you sign the front of the paycheck, the back of a paycheck, have a computer, use iTunes, watch movies, drive a car, use electricity, or if you smoke, look out. And if someone you know happened to have died in the last few months, don't worry, they have a retroactive death tax coming to you as well. So I think just about everyone is going to pay more. I think that's the easy way to remember this. Anyone in this room is going to pay more without seeing, as Brian pointed out, any meaningful reforms. I mean, they basically looked at a small deficit and decided that that was a good excuse to tax everyone. I sort of look at it this way. It's like if my wife told me she wanted a new flower bed, and if I operated the same way the Democrats in the legislature operated, I'd go out and buy a new backhoe and a bulldozer to make sure that I had the job done overly well, I guess. So that's really it. I think, and we can talk about some of the other things, the backroom secret deals for a couple of beneficiaries, but really it's everyone pays more is the way I think everybody's going to remember this session.
All right, there is a pattern developing here. Let's see if Todd will continue that. Todd?
Not a chance. You've heard me before. And first of all, thanks for having me. Thanks to the elected officials who are here. I apologize in advance if I say anything that you find in any way disconcerting. In terms of the legacy, let's remember that if you look at who our last three governors are, Jesse Ventura, Tim Pawlenty, and Mark Dayton, I think anyone coming from another planet who dropped into Minnesota would think we need therapy. Okay? We are having a very difficult time in the state figuring out exactly who we are. We are truly a purple state right now, and changes are happening. I believe the legacy of this session is going to be a little bit different than I've heard both sides of these talking points before, obviously a lot. I think the legacy of this session is that in 2014, we may have a lot more clarity on the political debate about the economic and financial challenge that this state is facing. And here's why. Number one, we took the most critical social issue off the table. This state now allows same-sex marriage. I do not believe we will be wrapped up in that debate in 2014. And it's nice to get that away because it really, if we want to debate the economic challenges, it's hard to have an issue like that hanging over us, which can easily dominate media coverage and political discussion. It's settled. We can now focus on the economic discussion. Secondly, I think both parties are pretty happy with what happened this session. If I'm a Democrat, I say we are leaders, we got done in time, we focused our priorities, you bet we raised taxes. Our governor promised that, folks. He promised that in 2010, if you put us in charge, we're going to increase taxes. Now, the debate over how taxes are increased and whether reform happens is a great debate, and I hope that's what happens in 2014. But that's what we did. We got it done. We told you what we were going to do. On the Republican side, I think they've got their mojo back. We're now focused on taxes and spending and the kind of choices we need to make and what exactly should be the price of government and the right amount of government spending. And this has the potential to be a really good debate. 2012 was not a good debate. It was a walkover. We had one party rocked with scandal, broke, and Kirk Bills was running for U.S. Senate. And I'm sorry, but he did not have the kind of campaign that could compete with Amy Klobuchar. This year, it's not going to be like that. There's going to be a good candidate for governor on the Republican side, a strong incumbent on the Democratic side. I think both parties are going to have a pretty clear message, and I think they're going to be messages that don't pass in the night like those two ships, but rather they're going to be messages that really directly deal with each other, and we may actually have an honest and somewhat satisfying debate over what government should be doing and what the effect is on our economy. And to that end, I think the legacy of this session is to really get us on the step forward to having the right debate, so maybe we don't have this constant churning of political results that we've been having over the last 12 or 14 years.
All right, thank you very much, Todd. And I will remind you that while people think the gay marriage debate is over, they also once thought the stadium debate was over. So one thing we've also learned in Minnesota is that debates over certain issues are never over. And I'll throw this out to whoever wants to jump in first. Every year, there happens to be a tax increase. There's a lot of hand-wringing about businesses will no longer want to come here. It's going to hurt the business climate, yet we still have a number of very healthy corporate headquarters here. I think it's Emerson is bringing 500 jobs to Shakopee in the old ADC facility, despite what I'm sure they've read in the newspapers about what happened here. And is there sometimes too much made of that, about what it's going to do? Dane?
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. You know, I've been covering this for 30 years, paying close attention to these rankings and to the business climate issues. It was my primary area of responsibility at the Star Tribune for many years. I wrote a series called Spending Big, warning about the growth of government in the mid-'80s. But when I hear this gasping around these numbers, the billions, I'm reminded of that Austin Powers movie where Dr. Evil threatens to destroy the world unless he gets $1 million in ransom. And of course, everybody laughs because it's 30 years have passed, and he was frozen in time, and $1 million is insignificant. And the fact is, and we have an economy in Minnesota that is growing and healthy. We're ranked sixth healthiest growth right now. Even the Chamber, which penalizes us more than other ranking agencies for tax obligations, ranks us 15th most competitive. And our economy over this next 2-year budget period, my buddy here, Brian, talks about $2 billion. The economy,
He said 2.5.
2.5, yeah. Don't forget the fees. I remember they used
short
to
them a half,
come after us for the fees.
the economy of this state over the next 2 years will account to almost $500 billion total. So we're fast approaching a $300 billion a year economy. And the increase in revenues will probably put the price of government dead even with where it is now. That's the total percent of revenues as a percent of income. That's the way all the serious economists and all the serious businesses look at the total price of government. So back in the 90s, we were at 15 or 16 or 17 or 18% as a price of government. We've been at 15 or 16% for a long time, and we're going to stay there. And Minnesota is going to be great for business, greater MSP, and a lot of business alliances are telling us.
we
Brian,
can't
are
be,
Democrats playing with fire by raising taxes? Because I'm sure you believe that this is just the beginning.
We can't be an outlier in everything. Minnesota has one of the highest income tax rates in the country. Now we're going to have the 4th highest income tax rate in the country and the 2nd highest at the level of $250,000 per household after only Oregon. We have among the highest property taxes in the country. We have among the highest sales taxes in the country. We have among the highest energy costs. We have among the highest health care costs. We have some of the highest regulations. So businesses look at all of that. We can't be outliers in everything. Minnesota becomes an island. And so we have to be careful. You can't add on burden after burden and say to the business community, don't worry about it. You're fine. You're going to be okay. You'll still grow jobs here. That's not going to be the case. And keep in mind, Governor Dayton proposed a whole host of tax increases that he dialed back at this legislative breakfast himself. Those are still ideas out there on the table that are under consideration. And so when businesses are thinking about where they're going to go, they look at the leadership of the state and say, is this a place that wants us? Is this a place where they want us to grow jobs? Or do they have something else in mind?
Let's
So
let
it is
Noah,
real.
let Noah and Todd jump in here. Noah.
No, I mean, I think there's been several examples just on the warehouse tax alone of businesses that have suggested they're leaving the state. I mean, if I'm an employee at Red Wing Shoes, I'm nervous. I mean, they said, look, we had the choice between Minnesota and Missouri, and Governor Mark Dayton made it easy for us. We're moving to Missouri. If you're Murphy's Warehouse, one of the largest warehousing distribution companies we have in Minnesota, he said in the paper last week, why wouldn't we move to Hudson? And if you look at that whole industry sector, why wouldn't we go to Chicago, where that's where the distribution hubs are? So we're killing industries. We're not just killing a few jobs here or there. And if you happen to run a retail business on a border in Minnesota where we're not competitive and soon to be not competitive on minimum wage, we're certainly not competitive on cigarette taxes, which is a huge revenue driver for these convenience stores. We're not going to be competitive if they get their alcohol tax, what they've said. And Tom Bach 2 days ago came out and said his biggest disappointment in the legislative session was not passing a gas tax. Well, again, we won't be competitive. So if you're on the border communities, if you're in the warehouse, or if you do any of the things that I outlined in my good news budget, we're not competitive, and we're going to see loss of jobs.
Todd, is the warehouse tax a potential misstep that you think might not actually even end up going into effect?
Well, I think 300, 400 bills get signed by the governor, and I guarantee you there has not been a legislative session that I worked at, lobbied at, or just observed from the outside where a couple things don't happen where the majority party goes, oh, wait a second now, maybe we can go back and we can play with that a little bit. And the warehouse tax, I think, is maybe a good example of that. I mean, I'm not a company that warehouses, and so, but I think we're going to find out pretty quickly if that's true or not. That shouldn't be surprising at all to anybody. I would just say this, though. The warehouse tax, I think, finally, is putting a face on a tax debate. I think one of the biggest problems the business community has had is that you say you're no to everything. Yeah, at least that's the perception out there. And I think it's difficult in a purple state to be no to everything and then expect great results. Okay, I mean, at some point there's got to be some kind of effort to I think, find that middle ground in some way. I'll give you a great example from what you've heard here, and that is that if you say you're against income tax, you say you're against sales tax, and you say you're against the cigarette tax, those are three very different taxes with very different incidences, with very different stability, and with very different social and cultural results here. And if you say none of the three are good, you're simply anti-tax, and therefore you're anti the investments. Now, you may be okay with that, don't get me wrong. That may be the positioning that you want, but I don't think that's the positioning that's going to give you a successful legislative session every year. I mean, we're going to see right now whether Governor Dayton's theory here, which is that the government's got to be a bit bigger and make more smart investments and put more money into infrastructure, education, and the like, whether or not that's going to be successful in the state. My advice to the business community is that, as you know, it kind of comes down to a couple of things. Number one is, are you going to stay here? And number two is, you're going to make the types of investments that grow jobs. And to the extent that you can tell a compelling story to the governor, to the legislative majority, the legislative minority, that demonstrates how particular things that happen during the session may affect those investments, I think you're going to be pretty successful. Because let's remember, business to business came off the table because some very good CEOs went in and explained pretty clearly what that would mean in terms of investments in the state. And I think everybody kind of got the message on that. And I think they'll get the message here too, but you got to be specific and you got to be clear as to what the impacts are. Otherwise, you're just part of the noise. Otherwise,
let's remember the business-to-business tax came off the table, except for the $200 million we're taking out of the pockets of business in the form of repair taxes, warehouse taxes, and other taxes. So we do have a significant amount of money, and I mean, I think that's one of the problems that we run into. And someone that's a small business owner has a family that runs a small retail business, we like to throw around these numbers of $1 billion here, $100 million there. Well, this makes the difference for a business that's on the margins, that maybe operates on a 2 to 3% profit, and you start taxing things at 6.5%, 7%, things that have never been taxed, things that these businesses don't have a chance to prepare for. That's real impact, and that's real people that are going to lose jobs because companies can't afford to hire, expand, or even continue their current payroll. I mean, these are real things. These are real people that are going to lose jobs because of these taxes.
Now,
Every serious tax reform study that's come down the pike over the last 30 years has said we need to lower the overall sales tax rate and broaden the base, including the governor's own 21st Century Tax Commission. The governor attempted to do that, but when the rubber met the road, it was unacceptable, and he pulled it off. But I don't think that debate is over. Actually, Minnesota's total sales tax collections on its general sales tax are not outlying high.
The rates
They're actually at 33rd among the states. So our sales tax and our property taxes actually are a relative bargain.
No, aside from the business taxes we've talked about, unless you're one of the top 2 or 3% of income earners in the state, or you're a smoker, you're probably not going to be impacted by tax increases.
Not much.
Yet, you are going to have, on the education side, Democrats are going to point out that there's going to be a tuition freeze at public universities, and all-day kindergarten is going to be paid for by the state. I did a story out in Minnetonka a couple of weeks ago. Right now, parents who opt for all-day kindergarten pay $4,000 out of their own pocket to make that happen. That's $4,000 the state is now going to pay. Of course, there's going to be arguments about how we got there, where that money is coming from. But Brian, as they go into the elections next year, that's a powerful argument. Yeah, some taxes on the wealthy and smokers did go up, but look at the benefits you're getting.
Well, but part of the question is, does government need to be growing like this? In the private sector economy, by GDP, is growing 2.5%, and now you have state government growing by 8 to 10%. So it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable to have government growing faster than the private sector economy. It doesn't work in the long run. And so people recognize and know that there is waste in government. There are inefficiencies. I mean, there's part of what was passed was $15 million in bailouts to pensions. And there's waste in the system. And so before we raise taxes, before we ask people to pay more, can we go back through the government programs we already have, find waste? If you want to reinvest, if you want to prioritize, if all-day kindergarten is an important thing to invest in, great. Let's find the money somewhere else in the budget, trim, make efficiencies. Everybody who works in a private sector business has been through that exercise of going line by line through your budget, finding where you can cut, and moving to those things that are most important. So government's got to do the same thing. So I think that's the argument that we're going to have, and that's, as Todd says, it's going to be a direct head-to-head discussion that's happening in the 2014 election. Does government need to keep growing like this, or can we find efficiencies? Can we continue to cut the waste rather than increasing spending? Because once you increase it, that becomes part of the base, and it grows from there. And so you're going to have to raise more taxes and more taxes in the future. And so this idea that it's only the 2%, it's only the smokers, well, now we know it's, warehousing, it's farm equipment, it's continuing to go, and so they're coming to all of us next.
Todd, on the education piece, is that something both Republicans and Democrats thought maybe there should be more money in education? Again, the question is, where did the money come from?
Right. And I got to tell you, I think the education debate is going to be terrific, because I think the discussion of the investment in all-day kindergarten is a great discussion. But on the other hand, I think Republicans have a very compelling message that $2 billion in taxes and the schools aren't going to be paid off any quicker than they would have been paid off when we were in charge. And that's going to be also a very good debate. I would just say, though, that we still have, and I think we've done it for over a dozen years and probably 20 years right now, we have avoided, regardless of whether we have divided government, Republican government, or Democratic government, some of the fundamental questions about education spending and investments that we need to make. And I believe leadership in every year tries to take on that battle, and it's very hard. It's very hard inside the legislative institution to put together a majority caucus of both Democrats and Republicans around true reform in both K-12 and higher education spending. And small things get done, but big things don't. And I think we all know that until we figure that out, and then on top of that figure out the health and human services spending, we are going to be chasing this kind of same debate. We're going to need some kind of fundamental reform, but don't talk to me, talk to Speaker Zellers afterwards, or talk to Ann Rest afterwards about how hard it is sometimes to bring a majority of people together around what's true spending reform, because a lot of oxes get gored when you do that.
Let me jump in on education quick. I think two of the biggest disappointments from the session, too, were getting rid of the graduation requirement tests. That we're dumbing down our diploma, that you won't have that test that students will be required to take to graduate. Other states are implementing those kind of standards. In Minnesota, we got rid of that test. We're also delaying and getting rid of teacher evaluations. And that's a real shame. So education reform took a big step backwards in the 2013 session. It's a story you didn't hear about a lot because same-sex marriage and the budget fights kind of dominated things. But this was a big step backward in terms of education reform. So I think that Republicans will be really taking that argument to people over the next year and a half. You'll be talking a lot about, shouldn't we make sure that Minnesota standards are among the best in the country? And shouldn't teachers be expected to pass a basic skills test? Those are common sense things.
I think, and we can just talk about the early childhood, because I know it's important to the TwinWest, both the board and I serve on the foundation board, and we've, if folks in the room don't know, just made a commitment starting last year to invest in in early childhood education as a business because we think there's a good return. Unfortunately, we as a state invested all that money up front, but then as Brian points out, don't do anything on the accountability side to make sure the investment we made up front actually pays off. And if you look at the studies, sure, you get a huge bang for your buck initially in your investment, but all of that investment goes away after the third grade if you don't continue with those standards. And frankly, our schools aren't doing a great job. The schools out in the western suburbs here are doing great, but if you go into some of our urban core schools, I mean, you're a coin flip on whether or not you're going to graduate, and that's sad. And we didn't do anything to address that. We got, as Brian points out, we eliminated the 9th grade writing exam. We eliminated the 10th grade reading exam. So we have kids going through schools without knowing if they can read or write, basic things. So, I think that was a real failure. I mean, I think everybody agrees we need great quality schools, but it can't just be about dollars in as a measure of success. It's really got to be about outcomes, and unfortunately, we took a step backwards.
Actually, a growing body of education experts say that the testing mania is out of control, that there's way too much testing going on in the schools. A lot of it's is meaningless, and a lot of it is not directed to actually helping the individual students directly off those test results. So there's a lot of policy debate, joined in many cases by conservatives against this, against testing. In fact, some of the more conservative red state tests are those that are rejecting the Common Core standards and more testing.
We've got just under 10 minutes left. Let's finish up on the transportation piece. There was an unusual amount of clamoring in some quarters this session for raising the gas tax. Ironically, right near the end of the session, I think we're right near the end of the session when gas went up to $4.50 a gallon in Minnesota. We were tops in the nation there for a little bit. Brian, I know it is something the TwinWest Chamber favors more spending on transportation infrastructure, highways and bridges and light rail out to this area.
And so does Brian.
How much is enough? I mean, how do you feed this
Yeah.
beast? You keep hearing these studies about how we need X number of billions of dollars just to stay where we are right now, and sometimes these numbers are almost not fathomable.
Well, right, and full disclosure, I work with the Minneapolis, St. Paul, and TwinWest Chambers on transportation and transit issues. But I think this is an area where if people see what their investment gets, then they'll support it. So the important thing is to have that discussion around, here's the type of transportation system that we can build if we invest in it. Here's, thinking about the Southwest Corridor. What Governor Pawlenty had always said is, look, I don't care what method we use to get somewhere. If by the numbers it makes sense, let's do it in that corridor. And the Southwest Corridor is a corridor where light rail makes sense. So we have to look at the entire area and see what method makes sense for that corridor, for that region, and then how are we going to fund that and pay for it? So
because how can Republicans reconcile what is usually a no new taxes mantra with the fact that to do some of these things you need a transit tax or you need a gas tax increase? They seem mutually...
Well, and remember, the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce supported the gas tax increase that was enacted over Governor Pawlenty's veto, with some legislators voting to override that. So I think the business community, where it sees that investments will pay off, where it can support jobs. So in the Southwest Corridor, there are 210,000 jobs today, and that's projected to grow to 270,000 jobs. So you're going to need options. So if you look at that and determine this, this is part of the infrastructure that the business needs to get employees to and from work, then I think you can make that case.
And Todd, is that what you need to do to make this case? You've got to show people what is the tangible benefit. If the gas tax is going to go up, how am I going to benefit? Is it going to be less time sitting out on 394? What's it going to be?
I think that the public in general is less opposed to a gas tax than I think sometimes we fear within the political institutions. I think they understand the need to make the investments. They have to sit in traffic. They have to go through the potholes. They get that. I think the one thing, and I tend to agree with Brian. I think one of the things that Governor Pawlenty did very successfully was that he basically changed the debate and asked people to really focus, asked both parties really focus on particular corridors and what the smartest investments are, and to get the right thing done there and figure out the right funding package to get that done. I think in this particular session, what this came down to was there were some other things that were a little higher on the list that needed to be sorted through. And I think they were. And now I think in 2014, maybe through 2015, I think the transportation issue is going to be sorted through. I think that the biggest struggle is always going to be how do you create a statewide plan, because you're going to be asking for statewide funding when at times it appears that the focus of the debate becomes very, very much around one or two or three very specific corridors when really there are tremendous statewide needs out there. But I think that debate's coming. I just think you're not going to see everything happen every legislative session.
If you go to our chamber friends in the North Metro, and their corridor was a priority, they have a North Star light rail that they literally cannot give away rides. So we're spending tens of millions of dollars, maybe billions, on a corridor that, the legislature in their wisdom said was going to, be full of people coming from Big Lake.
And Governor Pawlenty.
And Governor Pawlenty, sure. It's not a partisan issue necessarily, but it's, okay, if we're going to do this, let's be right. If we're going to spend billions of dollars, if we're going to impose some of the funding mechanisms like a metro-wide sales tax, which I'm glad the TwinWest Chamber opposed. I think we should be clear that we supported a bonding, use of bonding money for Southwest Light Rail, not some of these gas taxes or other tax increases, which I think is smart. But we need to make sure that these types of investments in high-speed rail make sense for the types of lifestyle that we have in Minnesota. And if you're not by a train, you're not going to ride it. And that's just the simple fact. So I think we'd be better spent widening the 494 corridor where it's 2 lanes. You can go down to Des Moines, which has half the population we have. They have a 4-lane beltway. We're still, in some cases, at a 2-lane beltway. Maybe we ought to look at investments there as opposed to something that maybe looks cool, sounds cool. We can put in our brochures, a nice little train, and something that's actually practical for the businesses in this community.
Dane?
Well, I would point out that it's a very conservative state and some very conservative metropolitan areas, including in Texas and Utah, Denver, and other places. They're moving way out in front of us in terms of light rail and in terms of transportation investment. I think the consensus is there on this. We absolutely have to move forward with mass transit. And in general, I think that I'm really impressed by a huge body of economic theory that studies the dynamic potential of what's called the creative class. And let's not forget that this legislature invested strongly in some growth clusters that are going to be important. The Mayo Clinic, this biomedical area is going to be our forte. It also invested in the Mall of America. This is a tremendous engine, and although there's a lot of dissent and criticism of that way of encouraging investment through tax breaks and so forth, that has to be considered a plus for business in the metro area and in the whole state. But all evidence is that the best and brightest young folks and professionals, business entrepreneurs and others want transit, bikeway, cultural amenities, great parks, first-class public education, higher education infrastructure, also a universal freedom to marry, tolerance and embracing of racial diversity. This is the future, and it's progressive with a small p.
Very, very quickly, do you think, given the trajectory of the economy right now, which I think most people agree in Minnesota and nationally is doing much better, coupled with these tax increases, how long until we're running some pretty significant surpluses and people are going to start saying, what are we doing with all this money? Should we give it back?
Yeah, next year.
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to have a surplus. That's the amazing thing is Governor Dayton raised everybody's taxes. Then we're going to have a surplus. He says, oh, now I'll give you a tax cut. So, but, I think people are going to ultimately question the wisdom of the initial tax increases. Now we're going to be going the other way. I think you're going to see surpluses in the very near future.
Joel, agree with that? Are surpluses on the horizon?
Yes.
And is that a good or a bad thing?
I think we'll have a $500 million or so in the November forecast. And what's interesting to me, I just have to point this out, is that we have 2 models here. A lot's been written about this lately. Wisconsin, anti-government, no tax, cut, anti-labor. Very different approach in Minnesota. Look at the differences in the growth rates between those 2 states.
I would say, Tom, I think there will be a surplus, absolutely, but I think variability is in our future. Because we chose the income tax as our primary way of increasing revenue, we have said that we're going to accept the significant waves that come with economic growth and then economic slowdown. And one of the things about the tax reform debate that may still happen one of these days is that it really is a debate about how you trade off a little bit of progressivity for a lot more stability, and we're still not there yet. What we've done so far is the revenue issue has been somewhat settled. The stability issue has not yet.
Noah, you get the final word.
I think you'll see surplus. I think actually the Republican legislators in the room deserve credit because had we done nothing this legislative session in terms of increasing revenue taxes on everybody, we would have had a surplus. So I thank them for their work, and actually their budget was the first time spending was lower than, government spending was lower than GDP for the first time in a decade. So I think they put us on the right course. I think that's why we are where we are. Hopefully these taxes don't have the significant negative impact to reverse those trends.
Well, I think you guys did a great job. I was the only one who actually played with the Citizens Bank doohickey during the entire discussion. I don't know what that says about me, but they were very attentive. I only listened to about half of what you said. But let's have a round of applause for our panelists. We managed to get through this without talking about stadiums, even though we've approved 2 of them that we can't pay for either one of them. So, and that we didn't even have time for that today. That's how much happened during this legislative session. But maybe that'll be the next discussion we have. Anyway, thank you all for coming. We please also want you to take a look at all of the sponsors on the wall behind me who made this all possible. Let's have a round of applause for all the sponsors.
A lot of sponsors.
And a special thanks again to the series sponsor, Grand Casino, Mille Lacs, and Hinckley. A round of applause for them. And everybody have a great day. We will see you very soon. Have a great day.